Hi everyone, welcome back to Steve's View. For most of the last 80 years, one assumption shaped the way Americans viewed the world. If Europe was threatened, America would be there. It wasn't just a military arrangement, it was part of America's identity. The United States emerged from World War II not only as the strongest economy on Earth, but also as the architect of a new international order. NATO wasn't just another alliance. It became one of the most successful security partnerships in modern history. American troops stayed in Germany. American nuclear weapons helped deter Soviet aggression. American taxpayers funded a massive military presence across Europe, and for decades, few people seriously questioned whether this arrangement should continue. But something has changed. Today, more Americans are asking a question that would have seemed almost unthinkable a generation ago. Why are we still doing this? It's a question that cuts across political lines, even if people arrive at it for different reasons. Conservatives may frame it as America first. Progressives may argue that resources should be redirected toward domestic priorities. Younger Americans, having grown up after the Cold War, often struggle to understand why defending Europe remains such a central pillar of American foreign policy. Meanwhile, America's national debt continues to climb. Infrastructure needs investment. Housing affordability is becoming a crisis. Healthcare costs remain staggering. And against this backdrop, many Americans look across the Atlantic and ask, if Europe is wealthy, stable, and home to some of the world's largest economies, why are American taxpayers still carrying so much of the burden? Now, before we go any further, it's important to separate two very different ideas. The first is that America is about to abandon Europe entirely. The second is that America increasingly expects Europe to take greater responsibility for its own defense. These are not the same thing, because despite the headlines, the United States isn't preparing to pack up its military overnight and sail home, at least not anytime soon. The reality is much more complicated. For decades, American leaders viewed European security as directly tied to American security. The logic was straightforward. Twice in the 20th century, devastating wars erupted in Europe and eventually drew the United States into the conflict. After World War II, American policymakers concluded that preventing another catastrophic European war wasn't just altruism, it was self-interest. A stable Europe benefited the United States economically, militarily, and politically. Then came the Cold War. The Soviet Union presented an enormous challenge. Western Europe, devastated by war, lacked the capacity to defend itself. American leadership filled the gap. NATO emerged. U.S. troops remained stationed across the continent. The arrangement endured because it worked. The Cold War ended without direct conflict between NATO and the Soviet Union. Communism collapsed across Eastern Europe. Many considered NATO one of the greatest strategic successes in American history. But here's the problem. The world that created NATO no longer exists. The Soviet Union disappeared more than 3 decades ago. Germany became Europe's economic powerhouse. The European Union expanded. Many European nations achieved extraordinary levels of prosperity. Yet, the basic security arrangement remained largely unchanged. The United States continued providing the overwhelming share of military capability, and over time, some Americans began to wonder whether the burden-sharing relationship had become unbalanced. This sentiment didn't suddenly appear with Donald Trump. In fact, President Barack Obama repeatedly encouraged European allies to increase defense spending. Multiple administrations expressed frustration that many NATO members failed to meet agreed-upon military spending targets. Trump simply said what many American policymakers had quietly believed for years. He said it loudly, he said it bluntly, and he transformed a technocratic debate into a political movement. The message resonated with millions of Americans, because from their perspective, it wasn't unreasonable. Germany has one of the world's largest economies. France possesses advanced military capabilities. The United Kingdom maintains nuclear weapons. Why, they asked, should American taxpayers continue underwriting European security at Cold War levels? Of course, European leaders often respond by pointing out that NATO isn't a charity program. It's an alliance. And alliances create benefits. American forces stationed in Europe provide strategic flexibility. European bases support operations beyond Europe itself. Political partnerships amplify American influence around the world. There is truth to that argument. But there is another reality reshaping this entire conversation: China. For decades, Europe represented America's primary strategic focus. Today, many analysts believe the Indo-Pacific will define the 21st century. China possesses enormous economic strength, rapid military modernization, growing technological capabilities, and ambitions that increasingly challenge American influence in Asia. Whether one views China primarily as a competitor, rival, or threat, few serious observers deny that it occupies an increasingly central place in American strategic thinking. And resources are finite. Ships cannot simultaneously operate everywhere. Military budgets face political constraints. Political attention itself is limited. Prioritization becomes unavoidable. Which brings us back to Europe. If America's greatest long-term challenge lies in the Pacific, should Europe assume greater responsibility for European security? Increasingly, many Americans believe the answer is yes. That doesn't necessarily mean abandoning NATO. It doesn't require dismantling alliances, but it may require redefining them. The difficult question is whether Europe is prepared for that transition. For years, European leaders discussed the concept of strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe should possess greater capacity to defend itself independently, yet turning aspirations into capabilities is difficult. Military spending requires political support. Defense industries require investment. Personnel recruitment requires cultural commitment. Weapons stockpiles require long-term planning. These aren't problems that disappear overnight. And recent events have highlighted Europe's continued dependence on American support. This creates an uncomfortable paradox. Many Europeans express concern about excessive reliance on the United States. Yet reducing that reliance demands choices that can be politically unpopular. Higher taxes, larger defense budgets, potentially reduced spending elsewhere. These are difficult conversations in any democracy. Meanwhile, Americans face their own dilemma. Should the United States maintain its traditional role as the indispensable leader of the Western alliance, or should it transition toward a model in which allies assume greater responsibility? Neither option is cost-free. Remaining deeply engaged carries financial burdens. Stepping back introduces uncertainty. Critics of retrenchment warn that reduced American involvement could encourage adversaries. They argue that deterrence works precisely because American commitments remain credible. Supporters of a more restrained approach counter that endless obligations eventually weaken the United States itself. They ask whether a nation struggling with debt, polarization, and domestic challenges can indefinitely sustain global commitments built for a different era. These competing visions reflect a deeper disagreement about America's identity. What kind of country does America want to be? Should it remain the principal guarantor of international order? Should it selectively engage where core interests are at stake? Or should it focus primarily inward, prioritizing domestic renewal above all else? These questions extend beyond party politics. Republicans debate them, Democrats debate them, foreign policy experts debate them, and increasingly, ordinary Americans debate them too. Because foreign policy ultimately reflects national priorities, every dollar spent abroad cannot be spent elsewhere. Every military deployment involves trade-offs. Every alliance requires maintenance. Yet it's also important to recognize what America gains from international leadership: influence, access, partnerships, economic relationships, the ability to shape rules rather than merely react to them. The post-war order, for all its imperfections, coincided with unprecedented American prosperity and global influence. Walking away from that system entirely would carry consequences. Perhaps the real question isn't whether America should defend Europe. Perhaps the question is how. What should the balance of responsibility look like in the 21st century? What level of burden sharing is fair? How can alliances evolve without collapsing? These are practical questions, not ideological ones. Because despite dramatic headlines, the most likely future isn't complete American withdrawal from Europe, nor is it a return to the unquestioned assumptions of the Cold War. The future probably lies somewhere in between. A Europe expected to contribute more, and America seeking greater strategic flexibility. A NATO adapting to new realities rather than disappearing altogether. This transition may be messy. Disagreements are inevitable. Domestic politics on both sides of the Atlantic will shape outcomes. But the underlying trend appears increasingly difficult to ignore. American patience with unequal burden sharing is diminishing. European awareness of strategic vulnerability is increasing, and the geopolitical landscape continues evolving. For younger Americans especially, this debate offers an opportunity to reconsider assumptions that previous generations took for granted. Why did these alliances emerge? What purposes do they serve today? How should they adapt? These aren't abstract academic questions. They influence budgets, military deployments, diplomatic relationships, and ultimately, the role America will play in the world for decades to come. Perhaps the most important thing to understand is this. Questioning aspects of NATO does not necessarily mean opposing NATO. Advocating greater European responsibility does not automatically imply isolationism. Recognizing fiscal constraints does not require abandoning allies. Nuance matters. Unfortunately, nuance rarely dominates political conversations. It's easier to frame the debate in absolutes. America should leave Europe. America should never change course. Yet reality often exists between extremes. The transatlantic relationship has evolved before. It will evolve again. The institutions created after World War II were never intended to remain frozen forever. Successful alliances adapt. Unsuccessful ones fracture. The challenge facing policymakers today is determining how adaptation can occur without undermining stability. And perhaps that's the conversation Americans should be having. Not whether Europe matters. It clearly does. Not whether alliances have value. History suggests they do. But whether the structures built for the 20th century remain optimized for the 21st. Because beneath all the headlines about NATO spending targets and diplomatic disputes lies a much larger question. Can America continue serving as the world's primary security provider while simultaneously addressing mounting domestic pressures and preparing for emerging challenges elsewhere? Maybe the answer is yes. Maybe the answer is no. More likely, the answer involves difficult compromises that satisfy no one completely. But one thing seems increasingly certain. The era in which America's role in Europe escaped serious public scrutiny is over. The conversation has changed. The assumptions have changed. And whether people celebrate that shift or fear it, the debate itself reflects something important. Americans are reconsidering what leadership means, not because they suddenly reject the world beyond their borders, but because they are asking what responsibilities are sustainable, what commitments are essential, and what priorities should define the next chapter of American foreign policy. The question isn't simply whether America will defend Europe. The real question is what kind of global role Americans want their country to play in an increasingly uncertain world. And whatever answer emerges won't just shape the future of NATO. It may shape the future of the American century itself. Thanks for watching.